I am pleased to have the honor of introducing Dr. David Conner to our seminar this week. Welcome, Dr. Conner. Dr. Conner is a professor in the Department of Special Education at Hunter College, where he also serves as chairman of the department. His research focuses on special education, and particularly the overrepresentation of students of color in special education, teacher education, effective classroom practices, urban education, and qualitative research. As we read in the assigned readings for the week, Dr. Conner's work has been instrumental in illuminating and complicating the debate surrounding overrepresentation of students of color in special education. And he has foregrounded disability in broader conversations about race and racism. His role in conceptualizing the theoretical framework of discrit further illuminates the ways that disability and race are used in tandem to marginalize and exclude students in our education system. Dr. Conner has informed much of my own thinking about equity, ability, and difference. His work, particularly the theoretical framework of discrit, has been foundational as I have conceptualized my own dissertation study, which will examine strategies to mitigate overrepresentation through an intervention with teachers, and in my thinking more broadly about issues in education. I have learned so much from his scholarship and so look forward to his talk today. We would be remiss to examine educational inequities without considering the role of disability and ableism in perpetuating injustices. And I know Dr. Conner's perspective will push our thinking as we continue to deepen our understanding of urban research and specifically urban education. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with our class, Dr. Conner. And without further ado, I will hand it over to you.
Wow. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for Professor Trainer for inviting me to be part of this series. Thank you to Lindsay for recommending me and giving me that nice introduction. I'm happy to say that things have changed a little bit since some of that information, and I'm actually retired. And so I'm a professor emeritus, and that allows me to still teach as an adjunct because I like teaching, and also to still do writing projects and research with my colleagues. So that's what I, excuse me, that's what I also like doing. However, without further ado, let me take you into my presentation today. Is it okay if I go ahead and share my screen? The folks who are doing technology, okay, so here we go. All right, so the title is Growing Disability, Critical Race Theory, discussing past, present, and future considerations. And so in many respects, it's an overview of the work that I have been doing in over the last 30 years. It is not allowing me to scroll. Hold on. For some reason, oh, there you go. Sorry about that. However, before I get into talking about discrit and what we've been able to do, how it evolved, what we're trying to do with it and stuff like that, I also want to talk for a couple of minutes about this project that I've been involved in. When I was asked to present today, I had to make the decision on what to present about. I ended up speaking about the disability critical race studies. But I also wanted to talk about this project just for about 2 or 3 minutes, because when we have the doctoral seminar with students later, we should be able to talk about this one also, should we wish. And it's called How Teaching Shapes Our Thinking About Disabilities, Stories from the Field. And I did this because I wanted to link practice to research, not research to practice. What I did for this particular project with my good colleague Beth Ferry was we asked about 20 educational researchers who all started off as teachers, what came to motivate them about their research. And in order to do that, we asked them to write what we would call autoethnographical or memoir type stories in which they vividly described their early experiences, preferably in their first year, of working in education, particularly with students with disabilities. And so what we have found is through those really honest depictions and struggles of what it is like to teach, they came to know things that were not taught in textbooks, that perhaps were not taught within their families, and other means by which we understand disability. And they came to know what it is like to work with kids with disabilities. So I just wanted to sort of put that in there to say we can talk about that one later. All right, excuse me, I'm not plugging it at all. I'm just saying it's worthy of talking about later, should we have the time. So before I really begin, I want to also acknowledge my good colleagues here. Subini Anima, who works at Stanford University, and Beth Ferry, who works at Syracuse University. And one of the things I will do today is kind of render the ways in which our separate interests came together and how we were able to come together to develop some of the ideas that we have developed and hope that they will be of use to people. So that's their photographs if you don't know what they look like. And I thought it would be good for me to give you an overview of what I'm going to do, even though what I'm going to do is an overview. So I will start off by talking about the three of our backgrounds, interests, and research projects. I'll also talk about how Discrit came about. I will also talk about our past projects in which we then discovered people were actually more interested in our work than we thought they were going to be, and how it expanded. And I bring us into the present by talking about ways that we're using it nowadays. And I will focus upon three substantial Discrit projects that we're doing, and I'll end by talking about the possibilities of Discrit. All this to say is I hope that you will stay with me, because there's a lot of information in here and it can be a little bit dense. I really hate it if I'm boring, because I'm a teacher at heart, but there's a difference between doing an informational presentation and actually teaching live. So this is a little bit of a corny slide. I have a tendency to be corny, but I don't mind. I want people to be able to think in terms of theory, research, practice, and policy. One of the things that I've came to observe is that people in education or related to education usually identify with only one or perhaps two at the most. And what this does, I think, is a disservice to our exponential thinking, because whatever we talk about, we should be able to relate it to some degree to all of these different realms. So in many ways, I think it's useful, and I teach my doctoral students that it's useful to think of education almost like a table, and each leg is one of these realms that upholds the whole thing. You know, you take one away, our arguments become wobbly. If you take two away, the thing can fall down. So by acknowledging all of them, and I hope we do in our conversation, we can have much more robust and interesting dialogues. So I'm going to start off by talking about the backgrounds of me, Beth, and Subini. We all started out as teachers. I worked in urban ed settings in a segregated special education classrooms in New York City. Beth started out in a rural setting, doing sort of their baby steps of inclusive education, although she has worked in segregated segments too. And Subini worked in the juvenile justice system with youth who were incarcerated. So we sort of had an overlap in some of our original experiences and interests on disability, race, and social class. And these did inform our research interests. One of the first projects that I did with Beth Ferry was this book called Reading Resistance. And what we did was we compared the historical lead up and what happened during and after Brown versus the Board of Education around discourses of inclusion and exclusion, how they were framed in national debates, in the media, in letters to the editor, in op-eds, so on, in political cartoons. So we wanted to look at what the discourse of inclusion and exclusion was, because we found it particularly pertinent to issues of race and disability. We also did the same thing for inclusive education. So that was our first sort of entanglement of race and disability through a historical lens. And one of the reasons why I got interested in race and disability was because of my own experience as a classroom teacher. But based upon that, when I started reading the literature in special education and education in general, I did not find very much about the lived experiences of Black and Latino youth who are in special education, who are labeled learning disabled, and who were often in segregated settings. And so I thought, well, if this has been pretty much largely my experience, how come my world is not really reflected in the professional literature so much? And so because I had witnessed their experiences, I wanted to record them. And in order to do this, I developed an intersectional lens in which I brought together disability studies and critical race theory. And I looked at their lives at the intersections of learning disability, race and ethnicity, and social class, in that most of them were either working class or poor. And what I noticed in doing this work is how close in many ways disability studies and critical race theory had very similar interests, overlapping interests in, foregrounding minoritized voices, in using analyses to look at systems, structures, practices, how they impact on beliefs, historical accounts, so on and so forth, but they didn't really talk to each other. And so that's one of the things that we have tried to broach in our work together over the years. And so I saw this early, and I wrote about it in a chapter called Not So Strange Bedfellows, The Promise of Disability Studies and Critical Race Theory, back in 2008. So what I've done in telling this story, I'm just highlighting some of our different works so you can start to see how they are all chained together and how they all build upon one another, allowing us to deepen our conversations about what I think are important issues. So some of Beth Ferry's work, and some of them are still with me, was I was the special ed girl engendering disability from the standpoint of urban working class young women of color. And because I had looked at learning disability, race, and social class, I had not deliberately set out to look at issues of gender, but what we found was in our data, they were inevitably there, and they were really coming forth, and they merited a different look and a different lens and a different way of looking at things. So that's what we did with that article. Also, as you find out in Subani's work, young women of color who are labeled disabled or are in the school to prison pipeline are really not very well represented in research either. One of the other works that Ferry did, a dialogue we've yet to have, Race and Disability Studies, she simply put out there the whiteness of disability studies and how it had insufficiently engaged with issues of race. And this is in a lovely edited book by Kurt Dudley Marling and Alex Gurn called The Myth of the Normal Curve, in which you will see one of the themes that we talk about often is, what is normalcy? Where does it come from? How can it be utilized against people? So on and so forth. In the last example on this page, you have talking and not talking about race, social class, and disability towards a margin-to-margin approach. And once again, we were trying to bring closer maybe some of the gaps between disability studies and critical race theory in thinking what could be valued if we actually actualize their intersection in our analyses. So we pushed it as far as we could, and wanting critical race theory to take on disability and wanting disability studies to take on race. And so here are some of Subani's works. She had the same interests as us, but came aboard a little later, and in many ways has galvanized all of this thinking. And she was the one that actually came up with the name of Discrit. And also it was useful to us to work with somebody who worked in critical race theory and was a person of color, so that we could collectively try to move together this shared agenda. So if you see some of Subani's works, for example, she has challenging the ideology of normal in schools. And, in these inquiries, we say, like, where does normal come from? Who gets to decide that? How does it shift over time and space, according to whom, who benefits in those shifts, so on and so forth. We all, the cuckoo clock, we're going to have to excuse that. We also are able to bring forth links to normalcy, such as, the notions of normal as they are attached to the broad conceptions of disability and race. In the second example of Subhanee's works here, disproportionality fills the gaps, connections between achievement, discipline, and special education in the school to prison pipeline. We have her and her colleagues analyze data from the state of Colorado, and with a particular view of looking at how the achievement gap, and often the rhetoric and the focus on the achievement gap, subsumes other dynamics and other practices, and can kind of eclipse the view, the intensity by which we should be looking at the school to prison pipeline. And in the third one, we have undocumented and under surveillance, a case study of an undocumented Latina with a disability in juvenile justice. And here, one of the things that I think I like about Discrit in general is its ability to look at case studies that sounds a little clinical, but case studies or examples of the actual lived experiences of people, to juxtapose them with and to contrast them with pure statistics, which kind of disembody and make an abstraction things that actually happen. So she's able to convey in that article what it is like to be a female, undocumented, Latino, and labeled with an emotional disturbance label, including the types of services that students get when they're incarcerated. So this is a theme that she has built up and developed. And so, for example, in another article she did, Disabling Juvenile Justice, Engaging the Stories of Incarcerated Young Women of Color with Disabilities. Once again, she forwarded their lived experiences. And I have to say, Remedial and Special Education is one of the best journals for accepting articles that might trouble the field of special education in general. I will speak later to how many of these ideas are have the door shut on them, or held at arm's length, or are deflected and sent in other directions. But I will say Remedial and Special Education is usually okay about doing stuff like that. And this interest developed into Subhanee's book called The Pedagogy of Pathologization, in which she really looks at first-person narratives integrated into structural analyses. And so in using disability critical race theory and other theories, she's able to give a very interesting, complex rendering of how the social justice system positions and responds to young women of color who are, in all intents and purposes, steeped in disability and deviance in the minds of their educators and also in the curriculum that they're given. So this is another interesting aspect of Subhanee's work. So what happened was we three were able to come together and join forces. So if anybody has ever done research with another person who's simpatico, you realize you've found one of your peeps, and it is just the most delightful thing. And so, if we have that expression, if two heads are better than one, and so what I will say, if two heads are better than one, then three is even better. So in these, once again, corny little visuals here, we can see, a trio in the corner that are responding to something in a different way, perhaps causing a little bit of commotion. And in the other corner, you can see three who are, three pots who look like they're contemplating something or deep in thought. And we usually range between those two things, all right? In our case, it allowed for a synergy of thinking about how can we harness and direct our interests in this area, because we think more can be done with it, especially in relation to troubling our own fields of special education, including also disability studies for making it less white, etc. So this is what came of our putting our heads together. we wrote an article, and the reference is at the bottom, Disability Critical Race Studies, Theorizing at the Intersections of Race and Disability, and it was published in the Journal of Race, Ethnicity and Education. It's one of the resources I gave for the doc students today. I'm not going to go through all of these tenets. I'll just tell you a little bit of background of writing that article. It took us at least a year to write. We wanted to try to get it right so that it would be recognized and hopefully taken up by people and used by people. I'm not going to go through all of the tenets, but I will focus on 3 of them briefly so you get a flavor, if you're unfamiliar, about what our work tries to do. So for example, in looking at number 1, Discrit focuses on ways that the forces of racism and ableism circulate interdependently, often in neutralized and invisible ways, to uphold notions of normalcy. This has been our experience. There are many times non-recognition of race, non-recognition of ableism in our careers, in talking with colleagues, and presenting at conferences, and visiting schools, and doing professional development, all of those things. We wanted to trouble those waters. Number 4, discrete privileges, voices of marginalized populations, traditionally not acknowledged within research. We would like to expand research, who gets to ask questions, who gets to participate, whose knowledge is valued, in what context. Because quite frankly, although we can say educational research is forever expanding and experimenting and growing, at the same time, it is a culturally entrenched and located practice, and it sometimes does not see itself as such. And the last one I'll point out is Discrit requires activism and supports all forms of resistance. That's number 7. And this includes for us academic activism, challenging the status quo, putting forth ways of reimagining things, how to think about disability, how to think about race, how to think about the intersectionality of them, how to think of special education, inclusive education, how we look at kids, where we teach them, how we teach them. Because we do live in structures that are quite oppressive to many students who are in them, and we have to figure out ways to resist them to enable, the health and the safety of many students in them. And so we like to talk about ways that they can be resisted and what is in control of teachers, students, administrators, etc. So that's how we started off with disability critical race theory in the Journal of Race, Ethnicity and Education. And we have to give a shout out to David Gilbourne, who's the editor, who kind of took a chance on us in allowing us to publish there. So, because there was more interest than we thought there was going to be, we said, well, why don't we write a book about this, rather edit a book about this, in which we encourage people who we know or who we've heard of and whose work is somewhat attached to ours or has something in common with ours, to take a look at our original essay and then relate it to ideas within their own work. So that's how we came out with this book. And these are the topics that are in there. So bear with me. I don't want to bore you to death with this stuff, but I do want to be thorough. And I do think it was interesting how people originally came to this and the things they wrote about. So some of them are, for example, analyzing experiences of Black middle-class parents of children identified as disabled, unpacking the notion of goodness, and also these authors, Zeus Leonardo, Alicia Broderick, developed a thing called the ability line, paying homage to W.B. Du Bois. Considering common sense notions of learning and culture, we have to engage with people where we are, and the term of common sense is often brought up. So how can we unpack that and kind of utilize it to engage people in ways that perhaps they're not expecting to be engaged with? Expanding the analysis of the educational debt. Oh, there goes Big Ben. And I'm sorry, it's going to do 12 times. So I couldn't turn it off because otherwise it might break. Bear with me. My apologies. It's nearly done. All right, that's seeming like an eternity now. The other topics include reifying disability categories and looking at social reproduction and teacher beliefs about race and culture, countering oppressive discourses at the intersection of race and disability, connecting overrepresentation of students of color in special education to the school to prison pipeline, contemplating race, class, and ability in school reform, and foregrounding Discret's contribution to multicultural education, focusing on what's called out of place, that notion in Florida, a discrete analysis of George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin, and last but not least, forging a theory of multiple identity through coalition. And so as you can see, you can call this eclectic, you can call this a smorgasbord, potpourri, whatever you want, but we were sort of like delighted that people were able to utilize the tool that we were trying to develop in order to reframe, better understand, or explain their own works in ways that perhaps they had not done so before. And that's how that book came about. And with that, there also came other opportunities for us to continue expanding disability critical race theory, either because we submitted articles together or separately to journals, or we were invited to partake in contribution to encyclopedias or other journals. And so I'm going to highlight some of them, once again, to show how things can grow and morph and take form. So what was interesting is a review of educational research dedicated an entire special edition, coordinated by Adai Tefera and her colleagues, called Intersectionality in Education, a Conceptual Aspiration and Research Imperative. And there's maybe 12 contributions in that special edition. And we submitted a proposal to show ways in which intersectionality has worked looking at race and disability. And so this was ours. What that then required us to do was introduce our work perhaps to an entirely different audience. And so part of what we did and what we have to do every time we write about Discret is talk about you know, the folks on which shoulders our ideas are built, and these include, and you'll see them in the diagrams, the illustrations here, Anna Julia Cooper, W.E.B. Du Bois, Patricia Hill Collins, and Kimberly Crenshaw, the latter two being much more contemporary, although they did develop these ideas you know, from the 1990s onwards, and particularly in relation to being Black and being female, and how that gives a distinct reality, interpretation of the world, set of experiences that other people at different intersections do not quite get and will not understand unless it's articulated. And of course, the forerunners looked at issues of race and in particular gender, for Anna Julia Cooper. So what we did was did a review of the research who was using this, and we compiled a list, I can't remember of how many that we did at the time, but some of them were writing in ways that shed light on things that we already know what is happening, but in different ways and in specific contexts. So for example, one of them that I remember reading was about disability microaggressions within Latinx experiences in special education. And that was by Davila. And another one was by, I think, Erin Whitney, and it was on inclusive pedagogy through Discret. What are good projects that can be developed? What are the ways that we can get students to express themselves, to acknowledge their place in the world, to go forth with hope, to be able to analyze texts, documents, artifacts, and so on and so forth. So you can see how it is being utilized and acknowledged and is out there in the field. And then, for example, there's the manifestos of the future of critical disability studies. And so, you know, one thing leads to another, and critical disability studies really is about looking at power, power play, the relationship of disability and power. And so they invited us to submit a piece about Discret. And And so, you know, the word manifesto is a delightful word. It's also loaded for some people. They think it's mega lefty and everything. People can come to it as they want. But our bottom line is we liked contributing to it here because it did want to foreground disability and race in terms of how do we look at politics and power in our society. And it's just good to have race and disability represented in anthologies that are looking at all markers of identity along all axes of oppression, so that it is there and it is able to inform in ways that others can't. And we can also learn from other researchers who are looking at things in different ways too. We also were placed in this collection of disability critical race studies, of critical race theory in education, major themes in education. And it's like a 4-volume jumbo book, but it is some of the first times that disability has been integrated into some of the discussions there. So we did accomplish some of the things we set out to do, which was, you know, include disability within conversations around critical race theory. And it does belong under the larger umbrella of critical race theory, as well as disability studies. And also you have people who are doing interesting things. Kathleen King-Thorius, Federico Waite-Toller, they're interested in, assets-based pedagogy. And they are doing an edited book. And so they asked us, would you consider how to conceptualize and employ Discrit as assets-based pedagogy? So this is some of the things that we've done and we've written about. They are interested in things like, you know, universal design for learning, culturally responsive pedagogy, and we're able to braid them in to some of the things that we write about. And it's an example to show how disability critical race theory can be leveraged, because the bottom line, we've all been teachers, and this has to be useful in some shape or form to the lives of teachers and in the lives of students and how things operate in schools. And in why Discrit intersections of race, disability, past, present, and future, I promise it's entirely different than what I'm talking about today. But these are one of the things when you introduce something and you would like it to be utilized and get out and it's being taken notice of a little bit. I'm not saying you have to sing the same song. It's like, you know, when people have a record that gets a little bit popular and they feel like they have to sing it. But in every venue, there's a new audience. So you have to keep the certain basics of what you're saying nice and clear, with a rationale, with examples. And so that's what we've found ourselves to be doing a lot. We also try to have things with a different angle, a different take on things, including highlighting the work of other people. So that's what we're doing, is we're trying to grow Discrit as we move along. We're also using it separately and individually. And so for in this example, Subini wrote Discrit Classroom Ecology using praxis to dismantle dysfunctional educational landscapes with her colleague Deb Morrison. And in this, she talks about what would it mean to have a Discrit disposition. And she acknowledges that, you know, its roots are in culturally responsive pedagogy, that the pedagogy has to be relevant, that it has to be sustaining. She talks about using Discrit resistance in terms of how do we work with students in order to be able to get them to be comfortable, to share their realities, to bring forth their knowledge in class. How can we get teachers to have a component of themselves that is that is humble, that has humility, that makes them the learners in situations, even though they're responsible for doing the teaching. She has an element in there called Discrit curriculum, in which injustices of the world can be named and brought into the classroom, discussed, talked about, studied, analyzed, and students and teachers can relate them to their own lives too. And Discrit pedagogy, as we've mentioned earlier, which is really, apart from it being culturally responsive and those other things, it also is an outright rejection of deficit-based thinking of children who are poor, who are of color, who have a disability label, and how we need to shift in our engagement of them. and also see people of color as creators and holders of knowledge in our classroom. So this is for anybody who's interested in teaching. It is like, how do you relate to kids, especially if they're of different backgrounds to you? How do you engage them? How do you have enriching classrooms? How are you able to acknowledge the realities of their existence? How do you get them to tap into their interests? So these are some of the connections that we have in terms of a discrete pedagogy. And in terms of Beth, her work with her colleagues, this is one example, same as it ever was, the nexus of race, ability, and place in one urban school district. Here they're looking at geospatial analyses of the intersections of race, social class, disability levels, and levels of inclusion. And some of their conclusions involve things like the student level of placement in the context of their race, class, and disability really has to be analyzed, looked at, and thought about much more differently than it currently is within the norms of educational practices. One of mine that I've done with some colleagues is, apologies to Simon and Garfunkel in advance, is a bridge even possible over troubled waters? The field of special education negates the overrepresentation of minority students, a discrete analysis, and there was a network of us who do research on overrepresentation and issues of race and disability. And we were flabbergasted when a more traditional researcher, Paul Morgan, and his team began to publish a series of studies in which they said kids of color are actually underrepresented in special education and more need to be labeled and more need to be given services. And so we know that is a complex and a sticky issue in many ways, but I'll be honest, what bothered us most was they were getting op-eds in the Times, more than one. They were getting stories run about this, of course, because it was a provocative story. It went against 50 years of research and the fact that the federal government had policies on this that were subsequently stopped, by the way. So we felt strongly enough to call attention to how our field is really, in many ways, what I think is race evasive and just not willing to engage with particular frameworks of thinking. And so in a way, once again, it's a form of resistance to speak back and call the field out on what they're not doing, at least according to us. And in like a smaller piece I did, who's responsible for the racialized practices evident within special education and what can be done to change them? There's nothing like giving yourself a hard question and then sitting down, try to answer it. It's something I encourage folks to do because it really pulls you into clarity of thinking around complex issues, because it has to be straightforward, accessible if other people are going to read it, digest it, and make something of it. So that's one in which Discrit really undergirds that whole short article. And it's, it's an extension of the work of people like Harry and Klingner, who you will see underneath. Their work, I think it came out in 2006 and republished 2016. Why are so many minority students in special education? It is a long-standing practice when we look through history. And so, we have to keep doing this work. I also wanted to keep it real in that one, like what is our locus of control? We always need to have a deep empathy for teachers to have challenging, difficult, and rewarding jobs. And I don't want to point any kind of finger blame or any kind of that stuff, but at the same time, we also have to take everybody in consideration. What can they do? What have they done? What might they do in order to change the balance of how things are right now? So this brings us to the present and what I would say are three substantial Discrit projects that we're involved in. One is a second book in which we have 11 contributors. Another is the special edition of Race, Ethnicity, and Education on Discrit has 8 contributors. Another is a special edition of Journal of Teachers College Record with 8 contributors. And so I want to explain a little bit how this came about. Teachers College Press, much to our surprise, asked us if we would like to do a second book on Discrit, to which we thought, well, it's hard to say no when an opportunity like that presents itself. But we thought instead of asking people that we knew or knew of and invite them to relate themselves to the tenets that we put forward the last time, we would have an open call So we would get people that we did not know, and we would see how Discrit was being utilized in different ways. And so we got about 60, give or take about 60 proposals, and a book can only hold about 10 or 12. And so in analyzing all of the proposals, we said, oh my goodness, there are so many very genuinely interesting and unique ways of doing research, questions being asked, contexts that they're being done, some quite provocative, some dealing with things that we might even find mundane. And so in order to help grow Discrit, we decided let us commit to doing 3 collections of works around Discrit. So we did do the second book, and we did approach the editors of these journals and pitch them an idea. And each one is related to a particular theme that I will take you to soon. But it was sort of, those answered prayers, that expression, answered prayers, be careful what you wish for, because you think, can this idea be useful? And then it is useful. And then it sort of, it gets a little bit big, and you want to help people who are developing it in their own ways. So in many respects, Beth Subini and I are now invested in helping other people grow their work and utilize this lens, because we pretty much always used it before we called it what we did. And I'm now retired, and there are other people to do this work. Beth and Subini are still active in producing, and so anyway, I'm just explaining our rationale of what we've done. So let me tell you a little bit about the book. So we called it Discrit Expanded: Inquiries, Reverberations, and Ruptures. It's currently in press. We wanted to do inquiries because we wanted to tie it to research for obvious reasons. We said the word reverberations because we wanted to know where it was felt. And we wanted to talk about ruptures because we wanted to know where it has disrupted ways of thinking or doing in ways that would be potentially useful to people. There are 3 sections in this book. One of them is what we called it outward, inward, and margin to margin. And I will explain what those are as I go through them. And so in section 1, we have outward inquiries. And this was to explore how far Discrit has grown and expanded. This section examines how Discrit has been useful theoretically, methodologically, and analytically to shift attitudes and practices in academia, teacher education, classroom practices, and other domains. And so what I'll do is I'll just give you a sample of one from there. And so we have toward a Discrit approach to American law. And in some ways, this was kind of nice and this was fitting because the origins of Discrit are in law. So for them to be taken out and utilized in education in general, and then in disability in education and race in general, and then be fed back into law, it's almost like a full circle that gives us pause to think about things. So let me include some of the things that she brought up. So Morgan brings up that, the Americans with Disability Act has broad protections, but it still leaves people of color underprotected. And she talks into many different realms, and one of them is homelessness, that there's a disproportionate number of people who are homeless, and they're in public spaces, and they're highly policed. She also writes about the disinvestment in the mental health funding in our society, and the increase on law enforcement to resolve mental health issues. So we've all seen how things can go terribly, terribly, terribly wrong when the police are responsible for engaging with issues of mental health. And so she writes about that. She also asks, what can law do to protect multi-marginalized people of color? And in answering her own question, she takes us into equally interesting areas, such as the notion of disorderly conduct, for example. And she starts to unpack notions of normalcy around, well, what is orderly conduct, according to whom, and in what space, and in what area, and in ways that these notions can morph into the criminalization of poverty. She speaks, that's a very powerful phrase, the criminalization of poverty. And so this is just one example of how the work is being taken up by different people and utilized in their own. In the section 2, inward inquiries, we turn inward to ask essential questions of ourselves. For instance, as scholars using or even developing Discret, who are we answerable to? Who, what can Discret be used for, and by whom? What does it mean to enact a Discret analysis, and what difference does it make? How do we keep Discret critical and aligned with its radical lineage? These are some of the questions that we kind of pose for people to consider in relation to their own work. And I'll sample 2 very briefly. The first one is called Does Discret Travel? Global South and Excessive Theoretical Baggage Fees. Sort of like a catchy title there. And in this, Sarkar and her colleagues are welcoming and yet cautionary of having a disability critical race framework applied to India. And so she brings up the bigger conversation about educational principles can be misapplied when they are exported without a critical analysis or like a nuanced examination. And she takes the concept of inclusive education, for example, and when it is uncritically adopted, she has seen that there are not much changes in existing practices in education. And what she calls our attention to is the need to engage with local and cultural knowledge in relation to the ideas that are being brought in. And this in and of itself is a challenge to the northern dominance within educational theory, such as inclusive education. And so she's used Discret to expand and appraise intersectional, culturally relevant, and contextually grounded understandings of theories that are imported. One of the things she also calls attention to, she and her colleagues, is the notion of colonialism in general, and what does it mean to live in post-colonial times, which is sort of like being a recovering Catholic for me, no offense intended for anybody in the audience. It's things you will never be able to entirely shake off, but how do you reinterpret them? How do you still work within them? How can you sort of like still have positive things come from the experience? And she talks about colonialism being an example of racism and ableism, all wrapped into one that we don't automatically think of as such. And so plenty to think about there. In the second instance of this section, expanding the emancipatory possibilities of Discret by exploring the cultural experience of disability within contextualized community, Joy Banks and her partners talk about self-empowerment through cultural identity development. And what they write beautifully about is the refusal to internalize the dominant narratives in our culture about disability and about race, and the need to shift the paradigm internally. And what do oppositional identities mean when you are always rejecting and rethinking and reimagining the dominant discourses that have oppressed people? And so they do take a look at historical experience related to Black and disabled identity. But as all 3 of the authors are Black and have disabilities, he really put forth some very interesting ideas about the need to utilize, not the need, but the compatibility of utilizing Discret to further their ideas. And here's me hoping I've turned the all of the visuals off in case I was distracted. So I'm just hoping you're all not asleep. So anyway, I'm going into section 3. And in this third section, we ask questions that look sideways across the differences and divides, because they still exist. The divides that I spoke about earlier, they're still there, even though some of them have been breached in some ways. So some of the questions we asked here were, how do scholars push Discret further to account for differences that we had not fully attended to or that require more critical theorizing and analysis? What are the missing pieces or silences associated with Discret? Who was left out of this liberatory aim? Who or what can or should be Discret be in conversation with? Anyway, so in this section, I'll briefly touch upon 3. So Padilla, in his piece called Discret Reverberations as Spaces Towards Emancipatory Learning and Radical Solidarity, looks at Lat Discret, where he takes the Latinx experience of being a blind immigrant male, and his experiences moving from the global south to the global north. And just like Sarkar's chapter that I talked about, he looks at the imposition of normalcy, the unquestioned imposition of normalcy that is imposed on the global south when the global north ideas do travel. And so he calls for like a solidarity in order for us to work through some of the nuances that these issues raise. In the second example, unveiling the intersections of race and severe disability, Clark and colleagues look at students with complex support needs. And in a series of classroom ethnographies, they look at the differences in the way students are treated according to their race when they have severe or complex needs in school. And so they write about schools, ways in which schools can be color evasive. It's situated in the South with a history of racial segregation, and the special education systems in the South, where this study is taking place, are still segregated. And so in comparing and contrasting the way students are perceived and treated, they call things to our attention in terms of ways to better serve students with multiple and complex needs, but also they illuminate ways that these students push back, sometimes on the limited ways that they are taught, which is a revealing and insightful look into the worlds of the young women that they focus upon. And in the last example, in this section, theorizing the curriculum of colonization in the US deaf context, situation discrete within a framework of decolonization. Lashanda Lawyer looks at schools as a tool of colonization, as ways to inculcate and shape a population in ways that are not, all the ideas are not really very healthy. And these are the ideas that can hold some people back and hold some people down. So she wants to put discrete in dialogue with colonization, and that she does. And so she's arguing for not just that particular intersection being analyzed, but all of the axes of oppression. So as you can see, people have came to it in very unique ways, and we're just simply glad and grateful for that. So one of the special issues that we did that came out about, I think August, was race, ethnicity, and education, from the personal to the global. And we called it Engaging with and Enacting Disability Critical Race Theory Across Multiple Spaces. And we're indebted to the editor once again, because he takes a chance on us. And here's what we came up with. So we had about 9 articles in that particular publication, and I'll foreground a couple once again, because the purpose of this overview is to show you how disability critical race theory is being used in different ways. And so in Ocasio Stoutenberg's article called Becoming Belonging, the Fear of Everything Black, Autoethnography of a Minority Mother Advocate and the Movement Towards Collective Justice, you have the writer, who was an educator, who was a mother of a child with a disability. She has a son with autism, who was a person of color. She happens to be a Black Latina of Puerto Rican descent. She talks with, she writes with such beauty of her personal experiences of growing up labeled gifted, but that always being questioned, sometimes by the teachers, sometimes even by the professors in college, by her friends, parents, and so on and so forth. She also talks about her family's response to disability in general, and how it was in keeping with many other families in being, very restrictive, somewhat negative. She also talks about the perceptions that society has for her son, who is a young Black man with autism. And she describes one instance, for example, she became a parent advocate, and one of her specialty areas is parental advocacy. But they would often have people from the community come in to visit the parent groups, and she remembers she's being addressed to by a visit by police officers, and how they would keep saying, if you have a problem, just come to us. so on and so forth like that. And she felt a need to simply state, we have to be mindful that not all communities would be receptive to what you're saying, and the reasons for that, or something along those lines. And she said, of course, the room froze because it was pretty much largely white, if not all white, apart from her. But it gives the, it really conveys life at the intersections, and the ability for all of us to inform different members of society what we're able to see and know, and what we want them to be aware of, in certain instances. So that is a really powerful article, and I recommend people to read it. In another one called Bringing Disparate Theory to Practice and the Development of an Action for Equity Collaborative Network, passion projects, Tammy Ellis Robinson, who works in the Albany area upstate, is part of this was part of her community work as a professor, working with members of the community to sort of build alliances and look at what are their policies for supporting students and multi-minoritized students in schools. And so what she did when she gathered people together in a task force is she utilized Discrit to help people frame their thinking about who they are, what their experiences have been before they start to look at the issues, such as, excessive referrals, overrepresentation, what are perceived as behavior challenges, all that kind of stuff. And so in doing this, she said she found common ground for planning. Some of the conversations were difficult, but she did say it did yield her the results by which she could then continue the process of going forth and building with the district and developing projects that would look at the areas that we're all interested in around educational equity. And in global conversations, recovery and detection of global South multiply marginalized bodies, Shireen Iqtidar, and her colleagues gave a loving critique, that's what they call it, a loving critique of critical race theory and disability studies and the paucity of global intersectional disability politics. And they advocate for a push for a more global, more humane positionality beyond the Western cultural norms. And they seek to have educators and policymakers think differently about the global North and South divide, and caution us, as others have, about how Western hegemony functions, including the exportations of norms. So already we can see some connections and patterns between different researchers who are looking at the same issues in their research. And of the three big projects that we've done, this is the third. It's Teachers College Record. And it's in keeping with the conversation today, because part of what we're doing is imagining possible futures. And the particular theme issue was disability critical race theory as a lever for praxis in education. How can we make what we're saying, what we're doing practical? And so I'm just going to show you a sample of some ideas, and then we'll go into the home stretch. So one of the articles is called Emotional Geographies of Whiteness and Ability in Teacher Education and Research. And as we know, teacher educators are largely white. It varies in estimations between 79 to 90% of them, and they're largely female. And so what the authors do in this is they look at a thing called the geographies of exclusion. They want pre-service teacher educators to think about their lives so far, their experiences so far, and in particularly in relation to examples of exclusion. And so they ask people about their relationship to segregated classrooms in their school experiences at all. Also their experiences in school district zoning and who they were educated with and so on, to make them much more aware of where they actually are in relation to their experiences, especially if they're going to teach kids in diverse classrooms, which most teachers do. So they also in this trouble the notion of what experiences pass as normal, because they're not normal, they're specific to a certain group or even individuals, but the impact that that has on teacher candidates. And so in looking at how teachers perceive their own social worlds and unpacking that, they refer to what they call white emotionality. And they actually go to Forrest to say this is often weaponized. And so this is really when people start to get upset or I guess destabilized, maybe having feelings of complicity or whatnot, in terms of where they are in upholding notions of racial hierarchies. And so they trouble the notion that many teachers can sentimentalize suffering of their kids or be empathetic with their kids without doing anything about it. And this can be reworking on how they think about kids. This can be what is in their curriculum, pedagogies, how they teach, etc. So in a way, this does shake some teachers up. It's not meant to be blaming, but it's meant to be consciousness raising. But they do look at the ability of some teachers to actively block these efforts. And in this one, on standardizing emotions, an ethical critique of social and emotional learning standards, Caroline Clark and her colleagues raise important points. What they do is they surface the normative assumptions in Ohio's SEL standards, the social and emotional standards. And so they do an ethical critique of the social effects of these standards. And they utilize the 7 tenets of Discrit by which to analyze the standards. And what they found is the standards ignore anything to do with racism, ableism, and other oppressions, and they privilege civility over productive conflict. And in doing this, they focus on behaviors over the actual emotions that can be expressed by various people, including Black, brown, disabled, queer people. And so their point is standards such as this undermine the role of emotions in social justice movements because they try to take the emotionality out of the emotional learning standards. So how's that for irony? So I'm almost done. So in counter narratives, there's Discrit practice, disrupting classroom master narratives through imagined composite stories. We have a very interesting and creative piece in which 3 researchers work in dyads. So we have 3 critically conscious teachers of color working with 3 white practitioner scholars. And so in working together, based upon their positions, their personality, based upon their positionalities, you know, their education, their beliefs, they come to these 4 conclusions about how to potentially change what we teach and how we teach in our classrooms. One is the naming of the master narratives, so they're rendered visible, and how these master narratives work in classroom spaces. Also to imagine curriculum and instruction that can uplift students from multi-marginalized identities. So how do we create a curriculum that uplifts? 3, surface the very real tensions that exist in that kind of work and be honest in confronting them and working with them. And 4, begin to develop tools to actualize Discrit that can be shared with others. So that was almost like a think tank work with researchers simpatico with Discrit and teachers who are simpatico with Discrit, putting their heads together and based upon their teaching experience today, start reimagining what classrooms could be like utilizing this particular framework. And so, deep breath. The field of special education is seen to be race evasive. It seemed to, sorry, I need to go back. I looked at the time, I realized I've gone over a little bit, so I apologize and I will wrap up in 5 minutes. My questions for you to think about is the field of special education race evasive? Does the field project engagement with Discrit? I want people to think about the field, special education not being separate of education. It has to be attached to it in some way, even though the people in there sometimes don't like it. So on one hand, no, because people are engaging with Discrit, including those in special ed, inclusive ed, disability studies, so forth. And all of these examples, okay, this is how it's being used in many interdisciplinary areas. But on the other hand, the field is resisting it. And I'm going to wind down with a little experience that I had. And I'm part of a listserv called ProEd about researchers in special education. And recently, a conversation occurred about critical race theory. It was because it was given all this attention in the media, and it was, prone to hyperbole, all that kind of stuff. A distraction of other things in the news. And so it made the special ed list talk about disability critical race theory, which I don't think it has before. And I have to say the conversations were pretty bland, and they gave the, consensus that we can't have censorship, we must be able to speak our minds. And then somebody said, well, now we have Discrit. And so these are some of the responses from our leaders in the field of special education. One leader cautioned, we have the rise of Discrit, the application of critical race theory to disability. However, the apparent assumption that Discrit disability can be treated like other forms of diversity, such as color or ancestry, is to my mind one of the most pernicious ideas related to special education. I fear that if we're not careful, Discrit will capture imaginations and result in further devaluation of what special education is and does. And another exclaimed, I haven't heard of Discrit before this, thank goodness. And so to me, this is very troubling because these are leaders in our field and they don't want to engage. And on the subsequent postings, who I'd never make an appearance on these things, I pitched in and said, well, this is why we have it. This is why we actually evolved it. And this is why I think we can learn from it. But there are a lot of people who are really not very happy that we have developed this and called attention to certain things in our field. And so I have tried to show you how it came about, what we're doing right now, and also thinking about how it can be used in the future. In many respects, if you can recall the table analogy that I did a million years ago, I've asked you to think about how it has touched upon theoretical research, theory, practice, and policy. And so this is my last 2 cents for this. If we are going forward and we are doing further thinking around these issues, what does it mean to have a positionality identity as Discrit scholars, researchers, and people? What does it mean to be the center? What does it mean to center those at the margin of the margins? And while Discrit can be seen as a critical friend, what is some of the baggage it also may bring? And the tenets of Discrit were intentionally incomplete and in process. How might they be developed? These are just some things that I'll give you that you can hopefully think about if you are interested in this area. And I have to thank you because I went over by about 10 minutes, but I guess that's me, and I welcome any questions. Thank you for having the patience for listening.
Thank you very much, David. If we can get you to stop, yep, thank you for the stop sharing. That way we can see everyone, and we have some time left for questions. So there are 2 in the chat. Yanis, do you want to pick one and kick off the questions?
Yes. Thank you. First of all, thank you, David. I mean, this was impressive, and it was not boring at all. It was very engaging from the very first minute to the last. I have 2 questions. Pick which one. One is about granularity in the definition of whiteness, because I cannot see grouping, for example, whites that are, let's say, conservatives with whites who are like progressives. These are like both theoretically and axiologically, they're completely different mindsets. So should we be grouping them together? If yes, why? What are the unifying elements or the common elements, and what are the disjoint elements? That's so let's start with that, and then if we have time, we can address the other question. Thank you.
All right, so that's a good one. It's also a tough one. As somebody who is genetically white. There's not, that's just the way it is. But on the other hand, I think the notion of whiteness as a concept can be very useful. And I have to say, if it's used in certain instances, I can wince at it, depending on how and when it's being used. And on other occasions, I can say, yes, they've really nailed it in trying to show us. So I think how and who and when it's being used, why, I do an evaluation of it that way. But I do think it's a useful category. Like any singular description, word, label, it will never encompass everything that we mean by it. So I just think, like everything else, we have to look at who is using it, when, why, for what ends. And I think it can be a really useful tool. I mean, one of the things in special education is you will have those scholars who are writing about kids of color all of the time, but they will never respond to anything if we try to engage them about whiteness. And it just shows the positions of power in that dynamic. And some people just don't want to confront it. You know, the benefits, the privileges. It's like ableism too. And once that's a room full of people, you know, get up and put on a notice board over there, you know, the benefits of being able-bodied. And they started saying, oh, do we have to get up? Do we really have to move? And I was just, the beautiful irony in that, you know. So I think I am okay with the term of whiteness. I think that there's a journal on whiteness studies. I think it's comes from a well-intentioned, and I think it's meant to educate people in how whiteness, I know it's an abstract concept, but actually how it can practically operate, and so it can be useful. But on the other day, I was in another video call, and somebody was talking about we don't need white saviors, non-disabled saviors, you know, in doing these things. And I kept thinking, is he referring to me? Am I supposed to be offended now? I don't really know. I said, I'll have to think about that later. And if he was, I just thought, you know, my stance is I will always want to work within a coalition of people, and other people have labels and racial descriptions of them. So I think it's fair that whites do it, and not think of it as in a pejorative way, but just think of it as like, what do we learn by using this label in looking at this particular instance? So my answer there was a little bit all across the Ouija board, but I hope you got some nuggets of information that you can chew on.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
Can I just go back to Yanis's question? One more thing, because I'm looking now in the chat what he's got. And so my answer is yes. I think when people are using the term whiteness in their writing, they should explain how they're using it and why they're using it in their application to something, because you can't assume a reader will pick it up and use it in the same way.
Thanks. Lindsay, go for it.
Yep. Thank you so much, Dr. Connor, for speaking with us. It was very, very interesting. My question is around something you spoke about and that has come up a lot in your work around the relationship between research and practice. And I'm specifically curious about, you know, in your one piece, you provide a lot of ideas for teachers to take on or to consider in terms of ways that they can mitigate or counter overrepresentation in their classrooms. And that was in the who is responsible for the racialized practices evident within special education. And I'm curious kind of what you've noticed in classrooms of the take up of some of the tenets of discrit, and if you have actually seen teachers in their practice leaning into or utilizing or building from those tenets. So curious again, the practice piece and what you've seen in your work.
So what I have seen, you know, since I retired like 2.5 years ago, is I found my doc students who were teachers took it into their classrooms and are now doing research into it. So the one where they were imagining how to utilize it and lean into it and go forward with it, they're actually utilizing it, you know, in those ways. In terms of schools, I read an article by a practitioner for principals, basically saying this is how a discrete lens could be applied to your school in terms of your organization and your principle and your structures. In terms of people using it in their classrooms, I think, and this speaks to a larger problem, how scattershot it is practicing teachers and their connections to research. And I think I'm not leveling blame, because I think both sides, and even that we're conceptualizing the sides, is problematic. But there's always a huge disconnect. And so I'm always interested in anything that they'll be able to utilize. I get emails from people who said they've downloaded it and it'll be interesting or useful for their practice, but then I sometimes don't hear back from them. My hope is that, and I know that it exists, but I don't have you know, all of the instances of it, is that because Discrit is taught actively now in some teacher education programs, like anything else that is taught to people, they will go back into the classrooms and see what works for them, what feels right, to what degree. It's a difference if people are tenured or untenured. It's a difference between the composition of the schools, if they have an empathetic administrator and stuff like that. It speaks to what happens if you put an idea out into the world. You don't know how and when. And so sometimes some of the only ways we find out is through people's writing or people's feedback to us. But I'm wary of overdoing it. I'm happy that we've been able to develop this, and I think it will be useful to people. But there are no, we all know there's no magic bullets. It's not the best thing since sliced bread. It's a useful tool and way of looking at things. But I do think professional development could benefit from this, even by looking at a tenant of Discrit, or like Tammy Ellis Robinson did with the whole district, you know? Like, so how does it make us think about things differently if we're going to act upon old and familiar problems? How might it change how we're thinking about these problems in the first place? That is our hope, you know?
Thank you. Other questions?
So I also did, I'm really like a teacher practitioner at heart. And so just to kind of read a long presentation for an hour was like this is not my thing. So I just hope it touched upon some things that you were interested in or you could relate to. And even if you just want to make a comment on your own thoughts or your own work, that would be equally valid and appreciated here.
Maybe while people are thinking about that, I'd like to ask a question, and that is, you know, disproportionality is seemingly one of the most intractable, you know, problems in special education over time. And Discrit offers a way to disrupt some of the thinking, some of that thinking that hasn't really found solutions or answers to problems of disproportionality. And I'm curious about what you think is a relationship, or what Discrit might have to offer, specifically the study of disproportionality. So the ways that it's measured and the things that come from those studies, and if you could orchestrate a conversation, because our field is very polarized, in my opinion. So if you could orchestrate a conversation in that, what would Discrit bring to disproportionality and the way that it's constantly been studied and yet not in very productive ways, in my view?
Yeah, so it's a super good question, and it's a super hard question that should be simple. So I'll try to keep it simple. So I think that the disruptive nature of Discrit allows it to reframe things and make other suggestions about how and what to do. And like most things, I do believe in groups of people working on something, or a coalition of people working on something, and what everybody brings to the table being acknowledged and seen in relation to each other. But I do think it is a very tangled and vexed issue, because you might have people who are in the traditional camp of special ed who might not want even to recognize anything to do with whiteness, for example, or who might only want to have quantitative data analyzed and utilized. And it really has to be a coming together of everybody. And I think if everybody did come together and see what could be taken from each one that could help the issue, then, because I do believe in keeping hope, I I think it could be a better way forward in thinking about these long-standing problems. Everything from what we count, why we count, how we decide to count, what we're measuring, how we measure, why we decide to measure, people's actual experiences, because there still seem, and you have these very issues that are in the middle. Whereas you see people who I guess would be traditional special educators who unquestionably think special education is a good thing. And that's likely based upon their experiences and what they've seen done, but they don't realize the same label giving to a different kid can propel one to college with all kinds of supports, and it can set another one on a downward spiral. That's the part of the conversation that is not really paid attention to from my perspective. But between this article, should anybody care to read it, and the other one we did on what is lost from current ways of looking at disproportionality, there's literally like dozens of potential suggestions that came from other people as well as me around what can be done, because we should look at this with a different way.
Thank you. Other questions? Or comments? David also asked for comments, so feel free to share. Go for it, Jocelyn.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Conner, for your presentation. So I'm coming to this presentation with very little knowledge, if any, of special education and disability. But one thing that really stood out to me, this is more of a comment that I found interesting, was the few papers that you mentioned on sort of the exportation of norms to other parts of the world. I thought that was that resonated with me. I am a sociologist in training and have thought a lot about the exportation of our ideas of race in the United States and how those are sometimes exported and assumed to be salient in other parts of the world, in Latin America, for example, when in reality our categorizations are quite different. So that made a lot of sense to me, and I think it's really great and interesting that folks are bringing those kind of issues to light in some of your publications and opportunities for research. One question I had, just as someone who really knows very little about disability studies in general, is it strikes me that disability is a very large category of things that include, like, different labels that includes things more physical related, more mental related. I'm curious, it seems like discrete can be applied, and it has been applied in many different contexts. I'm wondering if there are kind of nuances to how it's applied depending on what specific kind of labels you're talking about, and if there's kind of tension or if there are kind of issues around folks with scholars and whether they're talking about the same thing or whether they agree on what's applicable and not.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, I'm glad you picked up on a couple of groups of scholars who are interested in looking at the exportation of ideas, and they're using discrete as an example, or so on and so forth. I think Westerners have to be humbling when their ideas are taken elsewhere. They can't be assumed to be projected and taken up by people as is. And I also think, state the obvious, it's a two-way street. So much can be learned by thinking of a particular theory or idea in a different context and what can be learned from that. Disability in and of itself is such an interesting topic because it is sort of like what's called a floating signifier. It can change meaning for so many different people in so many different ways. And it covers physical, cognitive, emotional, sensory, and it varies from culture to culture and people's reactions to it. So I think in considering it, we have to always look at what it potentially has in common. And what it potentially has in common is people with disabilities are often seen of or thought of in some particular ways, in some context, even if it's small or it could be large for their life, as outsiders or people who do not fit into what are culturally ascribed norms. And so even playing with that idea or thinking that idea, I think is meaningful and helpful, because one of the things that made me interested in disability is how can we have an equitable society if we're really not trying in earnest to provide access to people who might have difficulty accessing it, or people who have been told that you're so different that you don't belong with other people. And because that cuts across all of the other interest categories that we might have, like gender, nationality, sexual orientation, so on and so forth. So for me, it's a very rich category to think about. And we can't use it as a word and think of it's going to be universally understood or applied in whatever we do.
Giannis, would you like to take us out with the last question? And then we will take a break and come back. Everybody would leave, and then the doctoral fellows will come back to the same Zoom at 1:15. Is that right? Jacob, do I have that right? Yeah, so we can take a little break, give David a break, and then we'll come back to have a smaller group. But before we do that, Giannis, would you like to ask a final question?
Yes, it's also in the chat. My question has to do with accent and linguistic fluency in, let's say, in the dominant or host language as a form of disability. And do you know, have you thought about it? Are you planning to work on it? And do you know of any current work, or if anybody has done it? I would appreciate any references and pointers. Thank you.
Okay, so that's another really, really interesting one. So I don't think I have not done any work on it, and I probably won't now that I'm winding down and have limited time and stuff like that, but I'm absolutely sure that other people will have done it. I'm not sure that it would be conceived of as labeled as a disability, but I would also say that there are disabling practices in our society in general. And one is that, as I'm sure you know, and I often try to speak Spanish in Spanish-speaking countries, a person with a noticeable accent is often deemed as not as intelligent or as unable to engage in conversations in the same frequency, at the same rate, with the same depth. So I think what you brought up is the notion of perceptions of linguistic limitations that are not necessarily there, but sometimes people ascribe that they are there. One connection I have with what you brought up is oftentimes when kids are evaluated to see if they have a disability, like a learning disability or speech and language disability, for example, the assessment tools are often not in the language of strength, and so they're not allowed to show what they actually do know and what they actually can do. And so there is this very fuzzy gray area in studying kids who are emergent bilinguals who may or may not have a disability label. Those are just my immediate thoughts from the topic that you brought up, but I really haven't, I would need more time to think about it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much, David, for your talk. Let's give David a hand, please. And then we will reconvene at 1:15 for our smaller group. Thank you.
Okay, see you folks in a little bit. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.